A very warm welcome, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General.
President Russwurm, dear friends, it's really a great pleasure to be here at this Day of Industry, and I look forward to share with you a few thoughts and then sit down and actually answer some of your questions and listen to your remarks. Because we are now at a critical time for our security. Great power competition is on the rise. Our values and democracies are under pressure, and President Putin has brought war back to Europe. After the Cold War, we all hoped for and worked for a more peaceful relationship with Russia. Gradually, those hopes waned because of President Putin's pattern of aggressive behavior in Georgia, Aleppo, Crimea, and Donbas. The full-fledged invasion of Ukraine shattered any remaining illusions of constructive cooperation with Russia. And therefore, we are at a turning point in history. And what we do or don't do now will define our security for decades to come. So let me briefly share with you 3 things I believe we must do to respond to this more dangerous world. First, we must continue to support Ukraine. NATO has been assisting Ukraine since 2014, and over the last year we have provided unprecedented support. Germany contributes significantly to this effort with air defense systems, battle tanks, artillery, and ammunition. Our help strengthens Ukraine's ability to fight on the battlefield. They have been retaking their land and have the capabilities to retake more. We must continue to give them what they need to prevail as a sovereign, independent state. This is our immediate task. The more land they are able to liberate, the stronger their hand will eventually be at the negotiating table. We all want this war to end, but a just peace cannot be freezing the conflict and accepting a deal dictated by Russia. NATO is not party to the conflict, but we stand with Ukraine in its right to self-defense, a right which is actually enshrined in the UN Charter. Then second, we must further strengthen our own defenses. After Russia's full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, everyone understands much better why we need strong defenses. It is not to provoke a conflict, but to preserve peace and protect our prosperity. This costs money. So I expect leaders at the Vilnius NATO summit next month to agree a new defense investment pledge with 2% of GDP for defense as the minimum. And I'm grateful for Germany's contributions to our collective defense, including troops along NATO's eastern flank, jets in the skies of NATO allies, and ships as part of NATO's naval deployments. As we speak, Germany is hosting the largest air exercise ever in NATO's history, Exercise Air Defender, which I look forward to visiting tomorrow. Chancellor Scholz's historic Zeitenwende demonstrates German leadership in these dangerous times. I welcome that Germany has announced it will spend 2% of GDP on defense from 2024. And I also welcome that it started delivering on its commitments to procure the right capabilities to make the Bundeswehr stronger. This is important for German security, It is important for European security and for transatlantic security. We also need a more robust defense industry, and some of you are present here today. Our weapons and ammunition stocks are depleted and need to be replenished, not just in Germany, but in many countries across NATO. Last week, I had the privilege of engaging in a productive meeting with defense industry representatives. We discussed how to best ramp up production, secure supply chains, and remove barriers to our cooperation. This is key to sustain our support to Ukraine and ensure our own defenses. And third, we must end our dependencies on authoritarian regimes. You know that not so many months ago, many believed that buying gas from Russia was a purely commercial decision, only to learn the hard way that it also affects our security. So therefore, it was actually a political decision. Germany and the EU have made impressive efforts to diversify energy supplies. But we must not make the same mistake once again with other authoritarian regimes, not least China. China is not our adversary, and we will continue to engage and trade with China. But at the same time, we must avoid dependencies that makes us vulnerable. We must not rely entirely on China for critical raw materials and products. We must not export technology that can be used against us or lose control over critical infrastructure like 5G networks. Resilience is key to our security, and I welcome the strong emphasis on resilience in the German new national security strategy. We must continue to work together, government and private sector, because our security is a shared responsibility. Germany is a highly valued NATO ally. You have a remarkable industrial base and a very capable defense industry. So what you do really matters. I count on Germany's continued leadership and support to protect our people and values and to preserve peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I obviously have one or two questions, and then we actually might have time to have some questions from the audience. If I may ask my question first. You have said that the new national security strategy has been a good sign, and actually you've been quite optimistic about it. Now, I thought you wouldn't be, probably because, first of all, it's coming quite late, right? That we now say we want to get to the 2% of the GDP. And second of all, I think in the national strategy, it says we're going to spend 2% of GDP on average over the next years, which could be a kind of vague scenario, no?
Well, so first of all, it is an important message to all the NATO allies and to the rest of the world that we now have a very clear commitment from Germany to increase defense spending to 2%. That is something reflected in the national security strategy, but I'm actually also very confident that it will be reflected in what we agree at the Vilnius summit. And then it was also a message when the Zeitenwende was launched and the 100 billion extra was allocated for defense. But what matters for me is actually that this commitment to increase defense spending is also not only something which is demonstrated in words, but also in deeds, because defense spending has started to increase, enabled Germany to invest more, to buy, for instance, fifth-generation fighter aircraft, buy more air defense, and invest also in scaling up the stocks of ammunition and provide German support to Ukraine. Then, of course, I want more. So therefore, I expect a continued increase. And therefore, I also expect that when Germany, together with all the NATO allies at the Vilnius summit, we will agree not only to say that we will spend 2%, but that we'll regard 2% as the minimum of what we have to spend, Because in addition to agree to spending, we will also at the NATO summit agree what we call capability targets, targets for the different capabilities. And that's a list of thousands of specific capabilities that each and every ally should have. Battle tanks, planes, ammunition, ships, readiness, and many other things. And that has a price. And for many allies, that price will be higher than 2%. So there is no doubt that Germany, as other allies, have to invest significantly more in defense. Let me end by saying the following. I have been Minister of Finance. I have been Prime Minister. I know it's hard to increase defense spending. Because the reality is that if you're going to find $1 billion extra for defense, which we have to because we live in a more dangerous world, then there is $1 billion less for health, for education, for infrastructure, or for cutting taxes. So it has a price. But the reality is that all NATO allies, we reduced defense spending after the end of the Cold War when tensions went down. Now tensions have gone up and there's a full-fledged war in Europe. So if we reduce spending when tensions are going down, we have to increase spending when tensions are going up. And that's the reason why I expect Germany and all other allies to invest more in defense.
We're definitely going to see in the next couple of years what is actually going to happen. One question, again, before we're going to ask the audience is, you've mentioned that regimes like China, we have to be careful what we export, because we do not want to export something that actually strengthens them more and weakens us even more. Now, technology, we don't really know what the weapon of the future is, right? Artificial intelligence has been a topic today. How do you make sure to know what kind of product we can export and what not? Because potentially most of it can be of harm, no?
But I think we have to understand that this is not black or white and a very clear line. It is a blurred landscape where we have to make difficult decisions and address difficult trade-offs and do some risk management. Of course, there is no way we can have zero dependency on imports from a big economy, a big country like China, and that's not the aim. But not so many years ago, I think that many of us, and I was part of that, we thought that the more we traded with authoritarian regimes, especially the more we traded with China, the more liberal, the more open, the more democratic they would be. The reality is that China is less liberal today, more authoritarian today than 10, 20 years ago. So knowing that these countries are becoming more and more authoritarian, they don't share our values, they're cracking down on democratic rights in Hong Kong, we see how they treat minorities in their own country, and we see how they are threatening neighbors around the South China Sea, and how they actually are coming closer to us, also trying to coerce and threaten also NATO allies in different ways. That makes it absolutely certain that we cannot be, there is a risk when we make ourselves dependent on key commodities from China. It's not about turning off, it's not about isolating. We need to continue to trade and continue to engage with China, but we see, for instance, in some parts of the new economies of renewable energies and so on, a dependencies on raw materials, on rare earth minerals from China, which is extremely high. And that makes us vulnerable. So this is partly an obligation for countries, for governments to try to define some guidelines and set some restrictions on some of the core technologies. But it's also an issue and a responsibility for each and every industry. Because there's also commercial risks in making yourself too dependent on commodities from authoritarian regimes. And also, we have learned a lesson from Russian gas. It was a mistake to be so dependent on energy from an authoritarian power that used that energy to try to prevent us from supporting Ukraine. So we need to develop guidelines, we need to understand better. We are working on something called resilience guidelines in NATO. We try to help and to define some of these borderlines. But at the end of the day, it will also be an element of judgment, of risk management from each and every industry to find the right balance between engagement and trade, but not being naive and being too dependent.
Not being naive. So, question, does anyone have a question in the audience right now for Mr. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg?
Hold on to it, I'll let you speak.
Mr. Stoltenberg, thank you very much for your clear words, much appreciated. I'm representing the German defense industry, Susanne Wiegand, CEO of company RANK. We touched a little bit on China. Can you please elaborate very briefly on the NATO position and NATO reaction with respect to a potential escalation in Taiwan? And if this would happen, what will happen with NATO reaction? Thank you.
So first of all, NATO will remain a regional alliance of North America and Europe. NATO is not becoming a global alliance. But of course, what happens also outside the transatlantic area matters for NATO. And therefore, we are concerned when we see the threatening rhetoric from China against Taiwan. There is no excuse for China to use force against Taiwan. There is no way they should change status quo by the use of force, and any differences, disagreements should be solved by diplomatic means. Then, of course, if there was a conflict in Asia, it will matter for NATO, because what we see is that China and Russia are coming closer and closer. They exercise together. They are just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. President Xi and President Putin signed an agreement, a treaty, where they stated clearly that their partnership is without limits. So it is very easy to imagine a conflict that where Russia and China would one way or another operate together. So that just makes it even more important to prevent any conflict also in that part of the world, because to think that that can be isolated, I think is not longer the case.
The next question, can I add something to what she just asked? What would that mean, an escalation of the conflict, for US support for NATO in Europe? Could the US, do they have the capacity to be present and engaged on two fronts?
The US has, of course, great capacities, and they also realize that the protection of Europe is in the US interest. At the same time, the US, of course, doesn't have limitless capacities, and that just highlights the importance of European allies investing more in defense. This is something that NATO has asked for decades. The US defense budget is roughly 70% of NATO's total defense spending. So the risk of more global conflicts also that can involve US forces other places in the world than Europe just highlights the importance of one of my main messages today, that we need to invest more as Europeans, because we cannot totally be dependent on the United States. We need to do our share to a bigger or to a stronger degree than we do today.
Thank you. We have one more question from the audience. I'll hold on to the microphone.
So, Mr. Stoltenberg, first of all, you have made NATO more popular in Europe, and in particular in Germany, than ever before. If you think about 40 years ago, we had this demonstration against NATO double-track resolution, a very different world. What, and that's my question, what could we do to engage with China to prevent China from openly supporting militarily Russia?
So first, I think that it is important to engage with China to convey those messages, and that has been conveyed by NATO, it has been conveyed by NATO allies, that China should not provide any military support to Russia's illegal war against Ukraine. And I welcome the fact that Secretary Blinken, the US Foreign Secretary, actually had now long meetings both with his Chinese counterpart, but also with President Xi. And based on the reports I've read from that, of course, they haven't solved all outstanding issues, but the meetings have been good, and they have addressed a long range of issues, and I'm confident also addressed the need for China, or the message from the United States has has most certainly been that China should not provide any support to Ukraine. Then on the popularity of NATO, yes, you're right. So if you look at the opinion polls, we have record high support. But I think the reality is that it just reflects that people see what's going on. What we see is that a sovereign, independent, democratic state in Europe, Ukraine, has been attacked with a full-fledged invasion. And we also see the rhetoric from Russia, from President Putin, that this is partly about Ukraine. It doesn't recognize Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation, despite the fact that he has signed many agreements recognizing Ukraine as an independent nation. And one of those agreements was actually the agreement where Ukraine gave up all its nuclear powers. It had nuclear weapons, gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia and many other countries then signed that they will respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So that's a quite strong message that you violate so blatantly agreements that has been made again and again with an independent sovereign nation in Europe. One more thing about this is that we have to remember that in NATO, we were not surprised because partly we had very precise intelligence, which we shared as early as the fall of 2021. Precise intelligence of the Russian military buildup, precise intelligence of the intentions. So when the invasion happened, we were well prepared and we activated our defense plans. We deployed more forces in the eastern part of the alliance. We gave Sarkar, our supreme commander, more authorities because we knew also we were prepared, and therefore that morning we did all that. But we were also prepared because the invasion of Ukraine is part of a pattern. It started, well, we can discuss whether it started with Chechnya, but at least with Georgia in 2008, where they went into Georgia. Then the brutal warfare in Syria, and then the war in Ukraine didn't start in last year, in February. It started in 2014. That was when they took Crimea and a few months after went into eastern Donbas. So this pattern led to the biggest reinforcement of NATO in generations since 2014. With more troops, more defense spending, higher readiness, because we need to send a very clear message to President Putin that we are there to protect every inch of NATO territory. The last thing I will say is the following. Just weeks or months, a couple of months before the invasion in December 2021, he sent a letter or a proposed draft agreement to United States and to NATO. And he wanted NATO to say that we should have no forces in the eastern part of the alliance, introducing some kind of B membership for those allies that have become members after 1997. He wanted, of course, Ukraine to promise to never join NATO, but he also wanted NATO to promise no additional enlargement of NATO, including with Finland and Sweden. That prompted immediately Finland and Sweden to apply for membership. Because they realized that Putin tried to close the door. And when someone tried to close the door, then you can move in, and they moved in. So he went to war because he wanted less NATO. He wanted NATO to remove forces from the eastern part of the alliance, and there was no more NATO members. He has got the exact opposite. He has gotten more NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance, and Finland and Sweden as members. Finland already, Sweden soon. So the whole war has been a big strategic mistake of President Putin. He's getting the exact opposite of what he wanted.
May I ask you on the popularity of NATO, a very, very short, very last question, a very personal one. Would you like to go for another term, if they ask you?
It has been a great privilege to serve at NATO. I have been extended before. I made it clear that my term ends this fall, and I'm absolutely certain that the alliance is capable of finding an excellent successor. So it has been a great privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.